Hi, Hal. Welcome. Welcome. Back in New Hampshire. And gonna finish up the Nutcracker. Whee! So, do that. There we go. So the Nutcracker, given a sword by Marie and Fritz, defeated the King of the Mice at the end of the last chapter. And and the Nutcracker has invited Marie to come visit his kingdom, the land of the dolls. So here we go. The land of the dolls. I don't think any of you children would have hesitated for a moment to follow the honest, good-natured Nutcracker, who had never had a wicked thought in all his life. And Marie was all the more inclined to go with him, as she knew what a debt of gratitude he owed her, and was sure that he would keep his word and show her all manner of splendid things. So she said, "I'll go with you, Mr. Drosselmeyer, but don't let it be too far or take too long, because I haven't had enough sleep yet." "In that case," Nutcracker replied, "I'll take the shortest route, though it's rather a hard one." He went ahead, and Marie followed. He finally stopped outside the big clothes cupboard in the entrance hall. To Marie's surprise, the door of the cupboard was wide open, and she could see her father's fox fur traveling coat, which was hanging at the front of the cupboard. Nutcracker climbed nimbly, hanging on to the loops and trimmings until he was able to get hold of the big tassel that was fastened by a heavy cord to the back of the coat. When he pulled the tassel, a little cedar wood ladder came down through the sleeve. "Now, Mistress Stahlbaum," said Nutcracker, "if you just climb that ladder." Marie climbed, and soon passed through the sleeve. When she looked out through the neck-hole, a bright light met her eyes, and she found herself in a fragrant meadow dotted with millions of gem-like sparks. "This is Candy Meadow," said Nutcracker, "but in a moment we'll pass through that arch." Looking up, Marie saw the beautiful arch, which was only a few steps away. It appeared to be made of white, brown, and raisin-colored marble, but when she went closer, she saw that it was actually made of baked almonds and raisins, for which reason, as Nutcracker informed her, it was called Almond and Raisin Arch. The arch was enriched by a gallery that seemed to be made of sugar, and on it 6 little monkeys in red jackets were playing Turkish music. The music was so beautiful that Marie hardly noticed the pavement they were walking on, which looked like mottled marble, but was really made of artfully molded nougat. Soon she was surrounded by sweet smells given off by the woods on either side of the path. Glittering lights in the dark foliage proved to be gold and silver fruits hanging from stems of many different colors. The trunks and branches were decorated with ribbons and bunches of flowers, like the members of some joyful wedding party. When the orange-scented zephyrs stirred, the leaves and branches rustled, and the tinsel tinkled and crackled like merry music, to which the sparkling lights hopped and danced. Marie was in 7th heaven. "Oh, it's so wonderful here," she sighed. "This, mistress," said Nutcracker, "is Christmas wood." "Oh," said Marie, "if I could only stay here a while. Oh, it's so lovely." Nutcracker clapped his hands, and several little shepherds and shepherdesses, hunters and huntresses appeared, all so white you'd have thought they were made of pure sugar. They had all been strolling about in the woods, but Marie hadn't noticed them before. Now they brought up a dear little golden chair, put in a white licorice cushion, and ever so graciously bade Marie to be seated. She had no sooner done so than the shepherds and shepherdesses danced a charming ballet, while the hunters played ever so genteelly on their horns. But then, as if at a signal, they all vanished into the woods. "I beg your pardon," said Nutcracker. "I humbly beg your pardon, dear Mistress Stahlbaum, that the ballet should have ended so wretchedly. But you see, these performers are all members of our mechanical ballet, so they can only do the same thing over and over again. And if the hunters played so sleepily and feebly, there are reasons for that, too. It's true that the candy basket hangs right over their noses on Christmas trees, but a little too high, a little too high. But suppose we go on a little way." "I thought it was all perfectly lovely," said Marie, getting up and following Nutcracker. They skirted a gently whispering brook, which seemed to be the source of all the delightful smells the woods were full of. "This is Orange Brook," said Nutcracker. "It smells good, but it's not nearly as big and beautiful as Lemonade River. They both empty into Almond Milk Lake." And indeed Marie soon heard a louder gurgling and splashing, and saw the broad Lemonade River flowing in great biscuit-colored waves between banks covered with bushes that glittered like rubies. It gave off a cooling freshness that strengthened heart and lungs. Not far away, a dark yellow stream dragged itself sluggishly along, but the scent it gave off was uncommonly sweet. Beautiful children were sitting on its banks fishing for plump little fishes, which they ate the moment they caught them. When she came closer, Marie noticed that the fishes looked like hazelnuts. A little way downstream there was a sweet little village. Houses, church, parsonage, barns, all were dark brown, but roofed with gold, and many of the walls looked as if the mortar had been studded with shelled almonds and candied lemon peel. "That's Gingerbread City," said Nutcracker. "It's on Honey River. The inhabitants are beautiful, but most are dreadfully cranky because they have awful toothaches, so we won't stop there now." Just then Marie caught sight of a town made up of varicolored, transparent houses. When they reached it, Marie heard a merry hubbub, and saw thousands of lovely little people unloading heavy wagons that were drawn up in the marketplace. What they hauled from the wagons looked like colored paper and chocolate bars. "This is Candy Town," said Nutcracker. "A shipment has just arrived from Paperland and the King of Chocolate. The poor Candy Towners have received threatening messages from the Prince of Mosquitoes, so now they're covering their houses with special paper and building fortifications with the finely wrought tablets sent by the King of Chocolate. But, my dear Mistress Stawbone, we can't visit every small town and village in this country. The capital is the place. On to the capital!" Nutcracker hurried ahead, and Marie, bursting with curiosity, followed. Soon the air was filled with the scent of roses, and everything seemed covered with a soft roseate glow, reflected, as Marie could see, from a rose-red stream, whose silvery rose waters lapped and gurgled most musically. Gradually the stream widened and became a lake with silvery white swans floating on it. They wore gold necklaces and vied with one another in singing the prettiest songs, while diamond fish leaped in and out of the rosy waters in a merry dance. "Oh," cried Marie in delight, "this is the lake Godfather Drosselmeyer was going to make for me, and I'm the little girl who was going to pat the swans." Nutcracker smiled as though she had said something foolish. "Uncle could never make a lake," he said. "You yourself would be much more likely to. But instead of worrying our heads over that, let's sail across this rosy lake to the capital." The next chapter is The Capital. Nutcracker clapped his little hands. The wind came roaring over the lake, and the waves rose higher. A gondola made entirely of glittering jewels appeared in the distance, and quickly came closer. It was drawn by 2 dolphins with golden scales. 12 dear little Moors with caps and little aprons woven of gleaming hummingbird feathers leapt ashore and carried first Marie, then Nutcracker to the gondola, which quickly started off again. Oh, how lovely it was for Marie to glide over the waters in the gondola, with the scent of roses all about her, and the rosy waves below. The 2 golden dolphins raised their nostrils and spouted crystal streams high into the air, and as the spray fell in filmy rainbows, 2 silvery voices sang, "Who is this on the rosy water? A fairy or a fairy's daughter? Bim, bim, little fishes, sim, sim, golden swans, fairies come hither, fly through the spray, splish, splash, splish, splash, the rose spray." But the 12 little Moors, who had jumped up on the back of the gondola, seemed to take offense at the singing streams of water, for they shook their parasols so violently that the palm leaves they were made of rattled, and at the same time they stamped their feet in a strange rhythm and sang, "Clip, clop, clip, clop, down and up, blackamoor's feet must never stop, swans and fishes wiggle and glide, gondola must smoothly ride, clip, clop, clip, clop." "Those Moors are all very well," Nutcracker said, "but if they keep that up, they're going to make the whole lake rebellious." And true enough, a deafening hubbub broke out, a medley of strange voices that seemed to be partly in the air and partly in the water. But Marie paid no attention to them, for she was looking into the fragrant rosy waves from each of which a charming little girl's face smiled at her. "Oh," she cried, clapping her little hands. "Look, Mr. Drosselmeyer, Princess Pirlipat is down there. She's smiling at me as sweetly as can be. Oh, dear Mr. Drosselmeyer, do look and see." But Nutcracker sighed almost sorrowfully and said, "Dear Mistress Stahlbaum, that's not Princess Pirlipat, that's you, your own self. It's your own sweet face smiling at you out of the waves." At that Marie raised her head, closed her eyes tight, and felt ashamed. And just then the 12 little Moors lifted her out of the carriage and carried her ashore. She found herself in a small thicket that was almost more beautiful than the Christmas wood. Everything in it sparkled and glittered, but most wonderful of all were the strange, wondrously colored fruits which gave off a delicious fragrance. "This," said Nutcracker, "is Marmalade Grove, and over there you see the Capitol." And here I've got a bunch of concept art, several pages worth, from the ballet that Maurice Sendak designed the set for, so I'll just show those pages. Oh, that was an interesting still of my face as we flip through them to get to the next bit. So this is all the different scenery in the land of the dolls. And there's a little nod to where the wild things are. I love his beasts, Maurice Sendak's beasts. Okay. Food. The Capitol. And what did Marie see? How shall I even begin to describe the beauty and splendor of the city that now lay before her on a broad, flowery plain? Not only were the walls and towers of the most magnificent colors, but the shapes of the buildings were like nothing else on earth. For instead of roofs, the houses wore delicately plated crowns, and the towns were wreathed in varicolored foliage. As the two of them emerged from the city gateway, which looked as if it had been made of macaroons and candied fruit, silver soldiers presented arms, and a little man in a brocade dressing gown threw his arms around Nutcracker and said, "Welcome, noble prince! Welcome to Candy Town!" Marie was not a little surprised that so very distinguished a person should recognize Drosselmeyer as a prince. But then she heard so many fine little voices clamoring all at once, such rejoicing and laughter, such singing and playing, that she forgot everything else, and she had to ask Nutcracker what it all meant. "Oh, most honored Mistress Stahlbaum," Nutcracker replied, "there's nothing unusual about it. Candytown is a big, bustling city. It's like this every day. Let's just go on a little farther." They had taken only a few steps when they came to a large marketplace that was most amazing to behold. The houses around it were all made of sugar filigree. There were whole tiers of arcades, and in the middle stood an obelisk of cake with white icing, around which 4 beautifully carved fountains spouted orangeade, lemonade, and other tasty sweet drinks, and the basin was full of custard that you might have eaten with a spoon. But prettiest of all were the delightful little people, thousands of whom came thronging together from all sides, laughing and singing and joking. In short, the merry hubbub that Marie had heard in the distance. There were beautifully dressed ladies and gentlemen. There were Armenians and Greeks, Jews and Tyroleans, officers and common soldiers, clergymen, preachers, and shepherds and clowns, as many different kinds of people as there are in the world. On one corner, the tumult was wilder than ever elsewhere. People were scattering in a panic because the Grand Mogul was being carried past in a litter, escorted by 93 grandees of the Empire and 700 slaves. But it so happened that on the next corner 500 members of the Fishermen's Guild were putting on their annual parade. And unfortunately the Sultan of Turkey had taken it into his head to come riding across the marketplace at that very moment with 3,000 janissaries. To make matters worse, the grand procession of the interrupted sacrifice came along at the same time. The band played, and the adepts marched towards the obelisk, intoning their hymn, "Arise, give thanks to the sun." The result was a pushing and shoving and squeaking. Soon there were cries of lamentation, for in the crush a fisherman had knocked a Brahmin's head off, and the Grand Mogul was almost run down by a clown. People were beginning to punch and pound one another when the man in the brocade dressing gown, who had hailed Nutcracker as a prince, climbed up on the obelisk. An extraordinarily loud bell was rung 3 times, and he cried aloud, "Pastry cook! Pastry cook! Pastry cook!" Instantly the hubbub died down. The processions disentangled themselves as best they could. The soiled Mogul was brushed off, and the Brahmin's head was pasted back on, whereupon the same merry hubbub as before began all over again. "Dear Mr. Drosselmeyer," Marie asked, "what's all this about a pastry cook?" "Oh, Mistress Stahlbaum," Nutcracker replied, "here the name of pastry cook is given to an unknown but cruel spirit, which is thought to have total power over people. It is the destiny that governs this merry little nation, and the people stand so much in awe of it that, as the Lord Mayor has just shown, the wildest disorders can be quelled by the mere mention of the name. When that happens, no one thinks of earthly matters, such as pokes in the ribs or clouts over the head. Everyone looks within and says to himself, 'What is man, and what can be done with him?'" Marie could not repress a cry of surprise and admiration when she saw before her a castle with 100 lofty towers bathed in a roseate glow. Now and then splendid bouquets of violets, daffodils, tulips, and gillyflowers were strewn over its walls, accentuating the pinkish whiteness of the background with their glowing dark colors. The gigantic dome of the central building and the pyramidal roofs of the town were sprinkled with thousands of gold and silver stars. "This," said Nutcracker, "is Marzipan Castle." Marie lost herself in contemplation of the magic castle. But it didn't escape her that one of the main towers had no roof, and that some little men perched on a scaffolding of cinnamon sticks were evidently trying to put one on. But before she had time to question Nutcracker, he explained. Not so long ago this castle was threatened with destruction. The giant Sweet Tooth came along, gobbled off the roof of that tower, and was nibbling at the big dome. The citizens of Candytown bought him off by offering him a whole precinct of the city and a considerable part of Marmalade Grove. The giant accepted the offer, gorged himself, and went on his way. At that moment soft music was heard. The gates of the castle opened, and out stepped 12 pages holding lighted clove sticks as torches. Their heads were pearls, their bodies rubies and emeralds, and they tripped along on beautifully worked little feet of pure gold. After them came 4 ladies, almost as big as Marie's Clara, but so richly and splendidly attired that Marie knew they could only be princesses. After embracing Nutcracker tenderly, they cried out, "Oh, my prince, my beloved prince! Oh, my brother!" Nutcracker seemed deeply moved. He wiped floods of tears from his eyes, took hold of Marie's hand, and said with great feeling, "This is Mistress Marie Stahlbaum, the daughter of an eminent physician. She saved my life. If she hadn't thrown her slipper at the right time, if she hadn't outfitted me with the pensioned colonel's sword, I'd be lying in my grave, bitten to pieces by the abominable king of the mice. Tell me now, can Pirlipat, though a true princess, hold a candle to Mistress Stahlbaum for beauty, kindness, and virtue? No, I say she cannot." All the ladies exclaimed, "No," and fell on Marie's neck, gasping through their sobs. "O noble savior of our beloved princely brother, excellent Mistress Stahlbaum!" The ladies led Marie and Nutcracker to an inner room, whose walls were made of sparkling colored crystal. But what Marie liked best about the place were the dear little chairs, tables, bureaus, writing desks, and so on, all made of cedar or Brazil wood, strewn with golden flowers. The princesses bade Marie and Nutcracker be seated, and announced their intention of preparing a meal with their own hands. First they set out lots of little dishes and bowls of the finest Japanese porcelain, and plenty of spoons, knives, forks, graters, casseroles, and other kitchenware, all of gold and silver. Then they brought in the most wonderful fruit and candy Marie had ever seen, and began with their little snow-white hands to squeeze the fruit, crush the spices, and grate the sugared almonds. In short, they did all they could to show Marie what first-rate cooks they were, and what a splendid meal she could look forward to. Knowing that she too was well versed in such matters, she secretly wished that she could be allowed to give the princesses a hand. As though reading Marie's mind, the most beautiful of Nutcracker's sisters handed her a little golden mortar, saying, "Dear sweet friend, you who saved our brother's life, would you care to pound some of this rock candy?" While Marie pounded the rock candy so cheerfully that the mortar murmured a kind of song, Nutcracker related slowly and at great length the history of the cruel war between the Mouse King's army and his own. How the cowardice of his troops had brought about his defeat, how the hideous king of the mice had been on the point of biting him to pieces, and Marie had been obliged to sacrifice a good many of his subjects who were in her service, etc. As Marie listened to his story, it seemed to her that his words and even the strokes of her pestle sounded more and more faint and distant. Soon she saw silvery mists, which seemed to rise up and engulf the princesses, the pages, Nutcracker, and herself. She heard a strange singing and whirring and buzzing, which ebbed away in the distance. Higher and higher she rose, as though on mounting waves, higher and higher and higher. Conclusion. Then came a poof and a plop as Marie fell from an immense height. My, what a tumble! When she opened her eyes, she was lying at her little bed. It was broad daylight, and her mother was standing there. "How can anyone sleep so long?" her mother exclaimed. "Breakfast was ready long ago." Of course, dear reader, you realize that Marie, befuddled by all the wonderful things she had seen, had finally fallen asleep in Marzipan Castle, and that the pages, or possibly even the princesses themselves, had carried her home and put her to bed. "Oh, mother, dear mother, you can't imagine all the places young Drosselmeyer took me to last night, and all the beautiful things I've seen." Then she told the whole story almost exactly as I've told you. Her mother looked at her in amazement. "You've had a long, beautiful dream, dear Marie, but now you must really forget all that nonsense." When Marie went on insisting that it wasn't a dream, that she had really seen all those things, her mother took her to the glass-fronted cabinet, pointed at Nutcracker, who was standing on the third shelf, as usual, and said, "Silly child, how can you imagine that this wooden doll from Nuremberg is really alive and capable of moving about?" "But, mother dear," said Marie, "I know Nutcracker is young Mr. Drosselmeyer from Nuremberg, Godfather Drosselmeyer's nephew." Dr. and Mrs. Stahlbaum burst out laughing. Marie was on the verge of tears. "Oh, father dear, now you're even laughing at my Nutcracker, and he spoke so well of you. When we came to Marzipan Castle and he introduced me to the princesses, his sisters, he referred to you as an eminent physician." The laughter grew louder. Louise and even Fritz joined in. Marie ran to the other room, brought back her little box, took out the Mouse King's 7 crowns, and handed them to her mother. "Look, mother, these are the Mouse King's 7 crowns which young Mr. Drosselmeyer gave me last night in token of his victory." Mrs. Stahlbaum looked in amazement at the 7 crowns, which were made of some sparkling metal worked more skillfully than seemed possible for human hands. When the doctor, too, had feasted his eyes on the little crowns, both father and mother urged Marie to tell them where they had come from. But the child could only repeat what she had said before, and when her father scolded her severely and went so far as to call her a liar, she burst into tears and cried out, oh dear, what do you want me to say?" At that moment the door opened. The judge came in, saying, Oh, what's going on? Who has made my beloved godchild cry?" The doctor told him the whole story and showed him the little crowns. The judge took one look at them and said, "Stuff and nonsense, stuff and nonsense! These are the little crowns I used to wear on my watch chain. I gave them to Marie for her 2nd birthday, don't you remember?" Neither Dr. nor Mrs. Stahlbaum remembered a thing. But when Marie saw her parents smiling again, she took courage, ran up to Godfather Drosselmeyer, and said, "You know everything, Godfather Drosselmeyer. Won't you please tell them that my Nutcracker is your nephew, young Mr. Drosselmeyer from Nuremberg, and that he gave me the little crowns?" But the judge made a stern face and muttered, "Stuff and nonsense." And Dr. Stahlbaum looked severely at his daughter and said, "Look here, Marie, you're to forget about this foolishness once and for all. And if I ever again hear you saying this ugly, simple-minded Nutcracker is Judge Drosselmeyer's nephew, I'll throw Nutcracker out the window, and all your other dolls as well, including Mistress Clara." After that, of course, Marie couldn't say another word about her adventures, though her heart was still full of them. For as you can easily imagine, it's not so easy to forget such grand and beautiful things as Marie had seen. Even, esteemed reader or listener Fritz, even your friend Fritz Stahlbaum turned his back on his sister Marie whenever she began to tell him about the wonderful country where she had been so happy. He is even said to have muttered once or twice between his teeth, "Silly goose." In view of his usual good nature, I find this hard to believe, but this much is certain. From then on, he ceased to believe anything Marie told him. He formally apologized to his hussars for the injustice he had done them, replaced the insignia he had taken away from them with tall goose plumes, and gave them leave to play the Hussars of the Guard march again. Which was all well and good, but you and I know what a sorry figure the hussars cut when the nasty pellets began making spots on their red tunics. Though forbidden to speak of her adventure, Marie continued to be haunted by memories of the fairyland she had seen. Whenever she turned her mind to it, she saw it all again, and instead of playing as usual, she would sit still for hours, deep in thought. The others all scolded her and called her a little dreamer. One day the judge happened to be repairing one of the Stahlbaum clocks. Marie was sitting by the glass-fronted cabinet, lost in her dreams and gazing at Nutcracker. Suddenly, quite of their own accord, the words popped out of her. "Oh, dear Mr. Drosselmeyer, if you were really alive, I wouldn't be like Princess Pirlipat. I wouldn't scorn you because you had stopped being a handsome young man on my account." On hearing that, the judge exploded, "Stuff and nonsense!" But in that same moment there was such a bang and jolt that Marie fell in a faint from her chair. When she came to, her mother was watching her and said, "How can a big girl like you fall off your chair like that? The judge's nephew from Nuremberg is here, so be on your good behavior." Marie looked up. The judge had put his glass wig and his yellow coat back on and was smiling happily. He was holding by the hand a small but shapely young man with a little face as white as milk and as red as blood. He was wearing a magnificent red coat trimmed with gold and white silk stockings and slippers, and amidst the ruffle of his shirt he was carrying a charming bouquet. He was elegantly curled and powdered, and had a splendid pigtail hanging down behind. The little sword at his side sparkled as if it were made of jewels, and the little hat under his arm was woven of silk fibers. The young man had charming manners, which he displayed by bringing Marie all sorts of lovely toys, figures of the finest marzipan, including those that the king of the mice had bitten to pieces, and a beautiful saber for Fritz. At the table he obligingly cracked nuts for the whole company. Even the hardest could not resist him. With his right hand he put them in his mouth. With his left he pulled his pigtail, and crack! The shell broke into pieces. Marie turned as red as a beet when she saw the young man, and she turned even redder after dinner when young Drosselmeyer asked her to go with him to the glass cabinet in the parlor. "Go and play, children," said the judge. "Now that my clocks are telling the right time, I have no objection." No sooner was young Drosselmeyer alone with Marie than he went down on one knee and said, "Oh, my precious Mistress Stahlbaum, you see at your feet the happiest of men, whose life you saved on this very spot. You were kind enough to say that you would not scorn me as that nasty Princess Pirlipat did for becoming ugly on your account. In that instant I ceased to be a lowly Nutcracker and regained my former, not unpleasant, aspect. Oh, precious Mistress Stahlbaum, favor me with your hand. Share my crown and kingdom with me. Reign with me over Marzipan Castle, for I am king there now." Marie raised the young man to his feet and said softly, "Dear Mr. Drosselmeyer, you are a good, kind gentleman, and since in addition you rule over a charming country full of pretty and amusing people, I accept you as my betrothed." So then Marie was engaged to Drosselmeyer. In a year and a day he called for her in a golden carriage drawn by silver horses. At the wedding 22,000 of the most brilliant figures adorned with pearls and diamonds danced, and Marie is believed to be still the queen of a country where sparkling Christmas woods, transparent marzipan castles, in short, the most wondrous things can be seen, if you have the right sort of eyes for it. And that's the story of Nutcracker and the King of the Mice. And that is the end of the story. I always loved listening to the end chapters, because I have a sweet tooth, so I always loved listening to all the descriptions of the candy and all the different things made out of it. I sometimes wonder whether that inspired part of Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory, or Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, and the rooms with everything made out of candy. What a story. Thanks for reading and clapping. You're most welcome. Most welcome. And thank you for listening and for visiting. So for those who missed my introduction at the beginning, which I may or may not have given, that was quite enjoyable. I love reading out loud. But I'm Christine Williamson, and I'm in New Hampshire on the east coast of the United States, a couple hours north of Boston. So that's where I am. And the earlier chapters of this book, I uploaded them to YouTube, and they can be found by searching for them on YouTube or by looking at my Twitter feed, because I tweeted them after. And I'll be putting this up there as well, so once it vanishes from Periscope, it can be looked at again. Thank you for all the hearts. Thank you so much. So, until next time, I have to decide what I'm going to read next. I still do want to do the Jungle Book at some point. I've been thinking the Treasure Island, and possibly my own book. So, and I'm going to be doing some more sonnets this week. I need to refresh my sonnets in my memory. I've been so busy I haven't had as much time to play with them. So, again, thank you all for tuning in. Welcome and thank you to any web viewers who are there. Any of those would be delightful. Okay, awesome. Yes, thank you for everybody who tuned in, and signing out from New Hampshire.